The taxi pulled away, leaving me standing in front of the house I hadn't seen in years. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. My fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. This wasn't where I expected to end up, but life had a way of dragging you places you never planned on going. I took a breath and knocked. The door swung open almost immediately. My cousin stood there, leaning against the frame, that same easy grin stretched across his face. "Look at you," he said, pulling me into a hug, warm, familiar, but lingering a second too long. I forced a smile, stepping back. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and fresh linen, a mix of comfort and control. The open floor plan made everything feel too pristine, like a showroom instead of a home. I heard movement from the kitchen. His wife appeared in the doorway, her eyes scanning me quickly before she nodded. No words. Just acknowledgement. Then she was gone. That night, exhaustion pulled me under fast. But something woke me. A noise. Soft, deliberate. My pulse spiked. I lay still, listening. Footsteps. Slow, measured just outside my door. Holding my breath, I turned the handle and peeked out. The hallway stretched in both directions, empty. The air felt thick. The house was silent. But I wasn't alone. Mornings started the same way. Coffee already brewed before I even made it to the kitchen. My cousin, leaning against the counter, sliding a cup toward me before I could ask. "Figured you'd need it," he'd say with an easy smile, like he knew my habits better than I did. I thanked him, but the way he watched me take that first sip, it felt like something unspoken lingered between us. His wife was hardly around. Early mornings, late nights, always busy. When she was home, she barely looked at him, barely looked at me. It was like she existed in a separate world, floating through the house without ever settling into it. He, on the other hand, was always there. Asking how I slept, what I planned to do that day, finding excuses to linger. Harmless, right? Nothing crossed the line. But some things weren't about actions, they were about feeling. And the feeling was off. The house was beautiful, modern, welcoming. But something about being here made my skin itch. Like I was a guest in a place where the rules were different, where I wasn't supposed to notice the weight of his gaze, or the way silence filled the spaces between us. The board sat between us, pieces scattered, tension woven into the space like an invisible thread. "You remember how this goes, right?" he asked, smirking, fingers tapping against the table. Of course I remembered. Late nights as kids, battling over strategy, neither of us willing to lose. I played my turn, the room shrinking as he leaned in, watching me think. "You always overanalyze," he murmured, voice low, teasing. I rolled my eyes, but my pulse was unsteady. The game shifted from playful to something else, something unspoken. His gaze flicked to my lips. My breath caught. I pretended not to notice, but the air felt thick, heavy. I reached for a piece, he moved at the same time, and suddenly, too close. His face inches from mine, warm breath against my skin. Neither of us moved. A second stretched too long. Then a mistake, an accidental brush, lips grazing, so quick it could have been imagined. We both pulled back, silence crashing between us. He cleared his throat, looked away. "Your move," he said, forcing a chuckle. I swallowed hard, nodding, pretending my heart wasn't pounding. I convinced myself it was nothing. A mistake, a moment that never should have happened. So I buried it. Acted normal. Smiled when necessary, laughed when it felt right, carried on like my heart hadn't stumbled in my chest that night. He played along, never mentioning it, but something had shifted. His presence felt heavier, his glances lingered a second too long. When he handed me my morning coffee, his fingers brushed mine, deliberate or not, I couldn't tell. "Made it just how you like," he said, voice smooth, eyes watching me too closely. I mumbled a thank you, forcing indifference, but my pulse betrayed me. His wife remained distant, barely acknowledging either of us. It was almost easier that way. Until one evening. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Tea?" The words hung in the air, too casual, too sharp. My stomach tightened. She didn't wait for an answer, just held my gaze for a second longer than necessary before walking away. I exhaled slowly, gripping the coffee cup tighter. I should have left right then. But I didn't. It started feeling intentional. Every time his wife wasn't around, he was. Always nearby, always too available. If I stepped into the kitchen, he was already pouring my coffee. If I sat outside, he found a reason to join me. Small things, easy to explain, but the pattern was undeniable. That night it was just us. A movie playing low in the background, 2 glasses of wine on the coffee table. Harmless. He sat on the other end of the couch at first, but at some point the space between us disappeared. The air changed. His arms stretched across the back of the couch, not touching me but close enough that I felt the heat. I should have moved, but I didn't. He turned his head, watching me instead of the screen. I met his gaze, pulse drumming in my throat. He leaned in slowly, deliberately. I let him. His lips brushed mine, soft, lingering. No hesitation this time. No accident. When we pulled away, silence filled the space where words should have been. We both knew. There was no going back. The next morning everything felt different. The house, the air, the way my own skin prickled with awareness. I avoided him. Stayed in my room longer than usual, skipped coffee, took longer showers, anything to create space. But he acted the same. No awkwardness, no hesitation. Like nothing had happened. Like we hadn't crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. At breakfast, I sat as far from him as possible, barely touched my food. His wife, usually distracted, actually noticed. Her eyes flicked to me, sharp, calculating. He said something to you? The question was casual, but there was something underneath it, something I couldn't place. My stomach twisted. No, I lied, forcing a sip of water, forcing normalcy. She held my gaze a second too long, then shrugged, going back to her phone. But I knew she'd seen it, the shift, the tension. I told myself I would leave soon. That I had to. But something about the way she asked that question, the way she barely reacted, made my chest tighten. Like she already knew the answer. I needed to leave. Every instinct screamed it. I packed my bag, shoved clothes inside without folding, heart pounding as I tried to convince myself this was the right move. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was something heavier. A feeling that I had stepped into something I didn't understand. I grabbed my suitcase, made it halfway to the door before his voice stopped me. You know I don't want that. I turned, pulse hammering. He stood there, arms crossed, leaning against the wall like this was just another conversation, like he wasn't the reason I couldn't breathe. I forced a shaky laugh. It's not up to you. His jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. Just watched me like he already knew I wouldn't go. That night his wife barely looked at me. At dinner she scrolled through her phone, fingers tapping too rhythmically, too controlled. I expected a comment, a question, anything, but she said nothing. The silence was worse. I wasn't just afraid of what I'd done. I was afraid of what was coming. As something was. I could feel it. Dinner felt staged, like a performance where I didn't know my lines. The table was set too perfectly, wine poured before we even sat down. His wife moved through the motions effortlessly, never hesitating, never showing anything beyond polite conversation. But the silence between bites was thick, stretched too tight, like everyone knew something unspoken was circling the room. I barely ate, every nerve in my body buzzing. When I excused myself, my hands were unsteady. The air outside was cooler, easier to breathe. I leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. Then footsteps. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. He stood close, the warmth of his presence pressing against me. You've been avoiding me, he murmured. I didn't answer. His fingers brushed mine, a touch I should have pulled away from. But I didn't. He leaned in, slow, deliberate. His lips met mine, and for one reckless second I let it happen. Then a voice. Smooth. Mused. Don't stop on my account. My stomach dropped. I turned. His wife stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. Not surprised. Not angry. Just waiting. She didn't look shocked. She didn't even look hurt. She just stood there watching us, arms crossed like she had been expecting this moment. The silence stretched, unbearable, suffocating. Then finally she spoke. I was just waiting for you to stop pretending. Her voice was calm, almost bored, as if this was nothing more than an observation, not a betrayal. My stomach twisted. He took a step back, inhaling sharply like he wanted to say something, maybe deny it, maybe explain. But she didn't wait for him. She turned, walked back inside without a second glance, like we weren't even worth the reaction. The weight of it sank in instantly. He knew. She had known. Not just now, not just tonight, long before this. My pulse pounded in my ears. How long had she been watching? How much had she already decided? I turned to him, but his face was unreadable now, the easy charm drained away, replaced with something else. Guilt? Frustration? Fear? I didn't know. But one thing was clear. Whatever I thought this was, I had never been in control. I left before sunrise. The house was silent, still, like nothing had happened, like the night before had been a bad dream I could wake up from. My suitcase rolled too loudly across the floor, every sound sharp in the heavy quiet. I didn't see her. I didn't see him. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just the door closing behind me, the weight of it final but not enough. The drive felt endless, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly, my mind replaying every glance, every word, every second of a game I never realized I was part of. I told myself it was over. That I was free. But days later my phone lit up with a message, simple, deliberate. You really thought it would be that easy? My breath hitched. My fingers hovered over the screen, cold, unsteady. I wanted to ignore it, to delete it, to pretend it didn't send a chill down my spine. But I knew better. I could leave the house, the city, even the memories. But whatever this was, it wasn't finished. It had only just begun.